All right, our second research design in sociology and the social sciences is going to be looking at experimental method. When students hear about science, they often think of doing experiments. But what is it that makes an experiment an experiment? Think about a lab experiment in chemistry. They use very carefully sterilized glass, and they might mix two things together to see if one causes a change or reaction in the other. The glass is cleaned because the idea here is that we are getting rid of everything else but just these two elements, maybe magnesium and chromium. If there's sodium or something else mixed in there, we cannot know that it's the chromium that causes the change or doesn't change in magnesium. Wouldn't change if there's no reaction. That's what experiments help us do. They help us weed out all the noise and figure out if one thing, like race, causes a change in another, like getting hired for a job. And like in the other sciences, what we're doing here is we're isolating those two factors and manipulating one thing, race. Here we're manipulating the chromium by adding it to the magnesium. The thing that causes the change, as in surveys, is considered to be the independent variable. But by isolating these factors from everything else and then manipulating the variable, we're more easily able to show the causal process and direction, meaning that adding this one thing or changing this one thing causes a change in another. Like with the other sciences, we can pull people into a lab, or we can go out into the world to do our experiment, or go out into the field, as we call it. Let's look at how these work and how we're able to isolate and manipulate variables in experimental designs. All right, in lab experiments, we typically will pull people into an isolated psychology laboratory and impose some sort of situation on them. One example of this was that in one experiment, people were told to play the role of a prosecutor, and they were given evidence of a crime, a lot of different pieces of evidence, either a murder or an assault. What the researchers wanted to know was if the severity of the crime increased, were people more likely to withhold evidence? So by randomly assigning people either murder or assault, they isolated the severity of the crime as the cause for withholding evidence. When we change that severity or assign someone a higher level of crime, this is the manipulation. This is causing the change in the independent variable. And we see if it causes a change in a dependent variable, if they withhold more evidence. In this instance, information is recorded quantitatively. And if they withhold one piece, it has a code. If they withhold two pieces, there's another code for that. It all goes into a data set, as in the last video. We do this over and over again to see if people who get murder are more likely, and that's a statistics question, to withhold evidence. Right? Likelihood, probability. One of the issues with laboratory settings for us is that people may act a little bit differently in a lab than out in the world. And in this instance, people who aren't career prosecutors will probably also act differently. But the researchers did find that the severity of the crime did make people more likely to withhold evidence from the defense. If people are reacting to being in the laboratory or to the researcher being present, this is what we call reactive measurement. In other words, what we're measuring here, which is what we're doing by gathering data, is their reaction to us as a researcher, their reaction to us, rather than the actual experiment we're running. This can be an issue generally in the social sciences, but it isn't as much as one as we tend to think it is. We can also run field experiments. These have less of a risk of reactive measurement because we do them out in the world. Though often we use things like survey tools for this. We don't typically experiment directly on groups of people. In the same way you might see in a what would you do type video situation. If you haven't seen those, you can go look them up. They're sort of like social experiments, but not in a controlled and scientific way. So one version of this might be that people might be sent a story or an account of something and told to respond to it in a particular way. Um, so for example, maybe they're sent a story, or maybe they're sent a survey about welfare and insurance. Should people be given housing and unemployment insurance? The experiment comes in that we might randomly include above that survey a picture of either a white or a black person in it, or people who've been evicted. And then we see if people who randomly received a picture of the black folks are more likely to say welfare was bad. This was actually an experiment run on voters after the 2016 election, and they found that people who supported the president were more likely to say welfare was bad if they saw pictures of black folks there. Another kind of field study or experiment is called an audit study. And here what we might do is send out applications to like thousands of jobs and have basically the same resume attached. Again, what we're doing here, if the resume is basically the same, is we're weeding out all that other noise. And we're just focusing on this one thing. Maybe it's race or gender. And we just change that. Same resume, almost, in terms of quality, but we change the gender of the applicant. And then we see through statistics if the female applicant or the black or Latino applicant is less likely to get the job. Again, that's kind of a statistical question. By keeping that other stuff similar and only changing the race or gender, we're isolating the causal or independent variable and manipulating it. So like with surveys, what we have to do here is to do this over and over. So this can also be pretty expensive to do if you think about pulling a lot of people into a lab or doing a lot of surveys. But on the upside is that what experiments do really well is helping us know that this one thing can cause or does cause or is more likely to cause a change in another. So there are trade-offs with every method.